Thomas Dalmore was 17 when he first heard his father speaking in his sleep. It was 3 a.m. The house was silent except for the sound of breathing and the old pipes settling in the walls. Thomas had come downstairs for water, moving quietly through the darkness, when he heard it from the study, his father's voice, low and deliberate, forming words that belonged to no language Thomas had ever encountered. The syllables were harsh and angular. They seemed to cut the air as they were spoken, each word distinct and separated, like stones being dropped into deep water. There was a rhythm to them, almost liturgical. Almost like prayer, if prayer could sound like a curse. Thomas stood in the hallway, frozen, listening to his father repeat the same phrase over and over. The words never changed. The inflection never wavered. It was as if someone else was speaking through his father's mouth, someone ancient, someone patient, someone waiting. When Thomas finally found the courage to look through the study door, he saw his father sitting upright in his leather chair, eyes closed, still speaking those impossible words into the darkness. By morning, his father remembered nothing. He had no recollection of waking, no awareness of the hours Thomas had heard him speak. It was simply gone, erased from his mind like a dream that dissolves the moment consciousness returns. But Thomas remembered. And he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what he had heard in that study at 3 a.m, words that seemed to come from somewhere outside his father, from somewhere far older and far darker than the present moment. The Dalmore family had lived in rural Massachusetts for nearly 300 years. They were not wealthy, not prominent, not the kind of family that appeared in historical records or family genealogies that mattered to anyone outside their own bloodline. But there was something that marked them. Something that the men in the family carried forward, generation after generation, without ever speaking about it directly. Thomas's grandfather had been the same way. In his final years, confined to a nursing home outside Boston, he would sometimes wake in the night and speak in that same harsh, angular language. The nurses reported it. The doctors noted it in his chart as a possible neurological event, some kind of parasomnia or sleep-related language production. Nothing was ever confirmed. Thomas's great-grandfather had been known in the family as a difficult man. Silent. Withdrawn. He spent the last decade of his life in the basement of the family home, speaking to himself in words no one understood. His wife eventually stopped trying to understand him. She simply accepted that there was a part of her husband that existed in a place she could never reach. And before that, there were others. Men whose names were recorded in family documents, men who had apparently shared this same affliction, or gift, depending on how one chose to interpret it. Men who spoke in voices that weren't entirely their own. Thomas began to search through old family records. Letters written by wives describing their husband's nocturnal speech. Diary entries mentioning the old language or the words from before. References to rituals or practices that had been abandoned generations ago, though no one seemed to remember exactly when or why. The pattern was undeniable. The Dalmore men, all of them, spoke a language that had no source, no origin, no explanation. It simply appeared, generation after generation, passed down through a bloodline in a way that suggested inheritance rather than learning. By the time Thomas was 23, he had documented the phrase his father repeated. He had recordings. He had phonetic transcriptions. He had analyzed the cadence and syntax, trying to match it against every known language database available to him. There was nothing. No match. No connection to any living language or any dead one that modern linguistics knew about. His grandfather, before his mind had fully deteriorated, had taught him 5 distinct phrases. Each one identical to the phrases his father spoke. Each one identical, as far as Thomas could determine, to phrases that had been recorded in family documents dating back to the 1870s, over 150 years of linguistic consistency, passed down through a family that had never formally studied it, never written it down systematically, never taught it as a lesson. Yet every Dalmore son eventually spoke it. Around the age when they entered adolescence, the words would begin to emerge during sleep. At first, fragments. Single words. But gradually, over months or years, the full phrases would manifest, identical to the ones spoken by their fathers, their grandfathers, their great-grandfathers, stretching back into the fog of family history. Thomas brought his research to a linguistics professor at Boston University. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez listened to his recordings with increasing fascination and concern. She analyzed the phonetic structure. She examined the grammar patterns. She compared it to Basque, to isolates, to constructed languages, to linguistic anomalies from around the world. "I've never seen anything like this," she said finally, removing her headphones. "The consistency is unusual. The fact that it's been maintained across so many generations without any formal transmission is almost impossible to explain." She paused, listening to the recordings again, her expression growing darker. "There's something in the rhythm," she continued slowly. "Something in the way these phonemes are structured. I'm not an expert in ancient languages, but this reminds me of something I studied in graduate school. Something that most scholars have dismissed as pseudoscience." Thomas leaned forward. "What?" "There's a theory, very fringe, very rejected by mainstream linguistics, about linguistic memory. The idea that language could be encoded in human DNA, passed down not through cultural transmission but through biological inheritance. Most academics dismiss it outright. But your family's case, it's the closest thing I've ever encountered that might suggest." She didn't finish the sentence. But Thomas understood what she was implying. Something that shouldn't be possible. Word of Thomas's discovery spread through academic circles quietly but persistently. A family that had maintained linguistic consistency across generations without formal instruction. A language with no identifiable source. Words that seemed to exist outside the normal patterns of human language acquisition. Within 6 months, 3 separate research teams had approached the Dalmore family, requesting access to their records, their recordings, their testimonies. Thomas's father was skeptical, but Thomas pushed for cooperation. He wanted answers. He wanted to understand. Dr. Vasquez brought in a colleague, Dr. James Whitmore, a scholar of ancient languages who specialized in linguistic anomalies and extinct language families. Whitmore was in his 60s, gray-haired and intense, with the kind of focused attention that suggested he had spent decades chasing mysteries that other scholars had abandoned. He listened to the recordings for the first time in the Dalmore family home, sitting in the same study where Thomas had first heard his father speak the words in sleep. When he removed his headphones, his face had gone pale. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "It's been in my family for generations," Thomas said. "We don't know where it came from originally." Whitmore was quiet for a long time. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I'm a scientist. I base my conclusions on evidence. But what I'm hearing, there are phonetic patterns here that match a language I've spent 30 years studying. A language that was supposedly extinct for over 2,000 years. "What language?" Thomas asked. "I can't be certain yet," Whitmore said. "But if I'm right, if this really is what I think it is, then your family is speaking something that should have been completely lost to history. Something that no living person should know how to pronounce." He set down the headphones with trembling hands. "And worse," he added, "if I'm right about what this language is, then the fact that your family has been repeating it for generations suggests something far more disturbing than a simple linguistic anomaly." The interviews with Dalmore men, Thomas's father, his grandfather, even elderly cousins, produced fragmented but consistent testimonies about their experience with the language. They all described the same sensation, a voice that wasn't theirs, speaking through them. Not possession in the dramatic sense, but rather an intrusion of consciousness that felt separate from their own awareness. The words came from their mouths, but they experienced them as something being spoken through them, not by them. Most of them had no conscious memory of the full phrases. They could describe individual words or the sensation of speaking, but the actual meaning remained locked away, accessible only during the state between sleep and waking. "It's like someone else is remembering," Thomas's father described it. "Like the words are memories that don't belong to me, but they insist on being spoken through my body." The grandfather, in his final lucid interview before his cognitive decline became too severe, described something darker. He spoke of images that accompanied the words, fragmentary visions that came with certain phrases. An image of stone. An image of fire. An image of something being buried, or perhaps something being imprisoned. "There's pain in the words," he said, his hands trembling. "I can feel it when they come out of my mouth. Pain that isn't mine. Suffering that belongs to someone else. Thomas asked him directly, "Do you know what you're saying when you speak the words?" His grandfather looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "And I'm grateful for that. Because something in me, something deep in my blood, understands them. And I don't want to know what they mean." Dr. Whitmore worked with a team of specialists, linguists, historians, archaeologists, to attempt a translation. The work was painstaking. The language was unlike anything in modern linguistic databases. There were no cognates, no grammatical patterns that matched known language families. But slowly, gradually, patterns began to emerge. Whitmore believed he had identified the language as a dialect of an ancient Etruscan variant, predating even the established Etruscan language family by centuries. A language that had supposedly been completely lost. The translation work began. And as it progressed, Whitmore's behavior changed. He stopped attending public meetings about the research. He refused to discuss his findings with other scholars. He began insisting that the doors to his office remain locked, and he refused to allow anyone to see his translation notes. In one of his final emails to Thomas, sent at 2 a.m., he wrote, "The words are a confession. That's all I can tell you. Someone is confessing something, and they have been confessing it through your bloodline for over 2,000 years. I can't continue this work. What I'm reading, it shouldn't be translated. Some things are meant to remain in the dark." 2 weeks later, Whitmore suffered a severe stroke. He survived, but he lost the ability to speak. When Thomas visited him in the hospital, Whitmore's eyes conveyed recognition, but he could only move his head slowly from side to side, a gesture that might have been refusal, or might have simply been the involuntary movement of a man whose body no longer obeyed his will. The translation notes were found in his office, scattered across his desk, most of them burned in a small fire that appeared to have started in his wastebasket. The few pages that survived were water-damaged and largely illegible. But one phrase had been circled repeatedly, written in Whitmore's urgent handwriting, "I am buried alive." David Dalmore was 15 years old when the language began to emerge from him. But unlike the other men in his family, David was different. He didn't simply speak the words unconsciously. He began, gradually, to understand them. At first, it was just fragments. A word would escape his lips during sleep, and he would wake with a sudden clarity of meaning, not the meaning of the word in any conventional sense, but rather an emotional resonance, a sensation of what the word represented. As months passed, the understanding deepened. David began to hear not just his own voice speaking the words, but other voices underneath, older voices, layered and overlapping. He heard his father's voice. His grandfather's voice. Voices of men he had never met, men long dead, all speaking the same words in desperate unison. He kept journals documenting his experience. Dr. Vasquez encouraged him, understanding that David represented something unprecedented, a member of the Dalmore line who was beginning to bridge the gap between speaking the language and understanding it. By the time David was 17, he had begun to piece together a narrative from the fragmented phrases. What he described was deeply disturbing. The language, according to David's interpretation, was being spoken by someone trapped. Not physically trapped, but temporally trapped, someone caught in a moment of time, repeating the same confession, the same plea, century after century, through the bodies of descendants who didn't understand what they were saying. "It's like being trapped in a loop," David tried to explain to his family. "Like someone speaking the same words over and over, hoping that eventually someone will understand them. Hoping that eventually someone will listen." The emotional weight of what David was describing was almost unbearable. He spoke of the voice as ancient and exhausted, as someone who had been calling out for help across 2,000 years and was beginning to lose hope that anyone would ever hear them. "They are desperate," David said, tears streaming down his face. "Whoever is speaking through us, they are so desperately alone." With David's interpretive help and the surviving fragments of Dr. Whitmore's translation notes, a more complete narrative began to emerge from the ancient language. The speaker, still unknown, their identity lost to the centuries, was describing a moment of profound injustice. A death. A burial. Being placed in darkness while still alive, or something approaching that state. A moment of separation from everything known, from everything loved. But more disturbing than the confession itself was the apparent mechanism of transmission. The speaker claimed, in phrases David struggled to translate, to have bound themselves to a bloodline, to have woven their consciousness into the genetic code of a family, ensuring that their voice would be heard across generations, that their story could never be entirely forgotten. They didn't do it to curse us, David explained to the family. They did it because they were alone. Because they had no one else to speak to. Because being forgotten entirely was worse than being remembered as a voice without context, a language without meaning. The research team was divided on how to interpret this. Some argued it was a metaphorical language, a poetic way of describing trauma. Others suggested that David, despite his linguistic talent, was projecting meaning onto ambiguous phonemes. But the consistency of his interpretation with the fragmented notes from Whitmore was undeniable. The pieces fit together in ways that suggested genuine translation rather than invention. The Dalmore family had entered a state of profound psychological crisis. What had once been an inexplicable family quirk, the strange language the men spoke in their sleep, had become something far heavier, evidence of a presence, a voice, an ancient consciousness that had attached itself to their bloodline centuries ago and had never let go. Thomas's father, hearing David's translation of the phrases he had been speaking unconsciously for 50 years, experienced a kind of existential breakdown. He had been a voice for the dead without knowing it. He had carried someone else's suffering in his own body, speaking their pain night after night, without ever understanding what he was saying. The grandfather, already fragile with age, withdrew entirely after learning the translations. He died 3 months later, peacefully, in his sleep. The research team attempted to move forward, to understand the full scope of what the ancient language contained, to potentially discover the identity of the speaker and the nature of the injustice they described. But the Dalmore family wanted it to stop. They wanted the translation work ended. They wanted, if possible, to somehow break the connection between their bloodline and this ancient voice that had been using them as a medium for 2,000 years. Psychiatric counseling began. David struggled with the weight of understanding something that he could not explain to anyone who hadn't heard the voice themselves. Thomas felt the responsibility of having exposed his family to this knowledge, of having invited scholars to investigate something that might have been better left buried. The emotional toll was visible in all of them, in the heaviness of their movements, in the careful way they spoke about the future, in the way they now listened to each other's voices with new awareness of what might be speaking beneath the surface. 5 years have passed since David Dalmore first began to translate the ancient language. The research has been largely abandoned. Dr. Vasquez published a heavily redacted paper describing a linguistic anomaly in a New England family, but without revealing identifying details or the full scope of the phenomenon. Dr. Whitmore has never recovered his ability to speak. He lives in a care facility, communicating through a speech synthesizer, refusing all requests to continue work on the translation. But David continues to listen. The voice hasn't gone silent. If anything, it has become more insistent, more desperate. New phrases are emerging, phrases that David has never heard before, phrases that suggest the speaker is still trying to communicate something that hasn't yet been fully expressed across the centuries. David is now 22 years old. He has refused scholarships to prestigious universities, refused opportunities to pursue a normal life. Instead, he has committed himself to the work of listening, to being the voice for this ancient presence that has bound itself to his bloodline. I don't know who they are, he says, in the rare interviews he grants. I don't know what they did, or what was done to them. But I know that they are still here. Still speaking. Still hoping that someone will finally understand. He has begun to write down the phrases, to catalogue them, to work on a complete translation of the entire language. It's work that may take decades. Work that may never be finished. And sometimes, late at night, when David is sitting alone in his room, documenting the words that come to him in sleep, he finds himself wondering, is this voice truly coming from the ancient dead? Or is it something else entirely? Something that has learned to speak through human bloodlines, something that has perhaps been waiting in the spaces between consciousness for millennia, finally finding the one member of the Dalmore line who is willing to truly listen? The translation continues. The voice speaks on. And in the darkness of Dalmore homes across New England, The ancient language echoes through the dreams of men who carry within them the weight of a presence that refuses to be forgotten. The full message remains incomplete. The original speaker's identity remains unknown. And somewhere in the spaces between sleep and waking, a voice that is 2,000 years old continues to reach out, desperately, through the only channel it has ever found, through the dreams of men who bear the Dalmore name. What happens when the translation is finally complete? What will the ancient voice say when it has finished its confession? No one knows. And perhaps, some part of David wonders, that's exactly what the ancient presence wants, to keep speaking, to keep being heard, to ensure that it will never, ever be forgotten again.